Welcome to this week's episode of Insight. During this week's show, we're going to cover three topics. The first one's going to be an update on the summit that happened last weekend in Brussels between the Armenian Prime Minister, the EU President, and the dictator from Baku. And then we're going to move on to cover last weekend's Turkish elections. And then we're going to end with our last item of the week, which is Aliyev's latest aggressions against Armenia last week. Let's start off with the first item of the week, which is the summit that happened this weekend between Prime Minister Pashinyan, the leader of the EU, and the dictator from Baku. This is supposed to be followed up next month with a meeting on the European level that's also going to include French President Macron and the German Chancellor Scholz. What we're going to start off with is a statement that was put out by President Michel, which covered the following points. The first one is that both leaders confirmed unequivocally their commitment to the 1991 Almaty Declaration, recognizing each other's territorial integrity. Second is that they agreed on the ultimate delimitation of the borders, demarcation of the borders that should be agreed upon and acted upon by negotiations. Third one was regarding to connectivity, which is setting up establishing the railway systems between Armenia and Azerbaijan, which is quite problematic because most of that railway doesn't exist, and it's frankly going to take a couple of $100 million and a few years to even set this up if it's going to come to fruition. The fourth item was in regards to humanitarian issues, which are specific to the illegally held POWs in Baku by the Aliyev regime, and there was talks about some of them, or at least hopefully all of them, being freed soon. Lastly, and most importantly, and I want to pay special attention to this is in regards to Artsakh and the rights of the Armenians in Artsakh, and this is the exact phrasing that's used by Mr. Michel.
We continued our exchanges on the issue of the rights and security of Armenians living in the former Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast. I encouraged Azerbaijan to engage in developing a positive agenda with the aim of guaranteeing the rights and security of this population in close cooperation with the international community.
And we need to pay close attention to this last sentence.
I also raised the need for transparent and constructive dialogue between Baku and this population.
So this is essentially an encouragement or some kind of a commitment that Aliyev has made to engage constructively with the Armenians of Artsakh, which is hard to believe. Apparently, for Mr. Michel, transparent and constructive dialogue can happen while you're actually trying to starve a population into self-ethnic cleansing out of their ancestral homeland. Now, what does this all mean? To quote Shakespeare, frankly, this is a lot of sound and fury signifying nothing. All of the points that were outlined by Mr. Michel, minus the last one, have been made in different forums, whether in meetings that happened that were supervised by the United States or by Mr. Putin himself in Russia. And all of them have led to nothing, and they have all led to nothing for one very specific reason. That is, peace does not serve the interest of the regime in Baku, and peace will only be achieved when we upgrade our military capabilities. Let's move on to the second topic of the week, which are the Turkish elections, the first round of Turkish elections that took place last weekend. The elections are going to go to a second round because Erdogan finished in first place with a little over 49%, and the opposition with a little over 44%. This is heading to a runoff, which is going to come in about 10 days, 2 weeks. It's 2 weeks after the first election. The reality is that Erdogan actually performed rather strongly, and he's quite likely to win in the second round. In fact, in the parliamentary election, his coalition of Islamist, nationalist, and fascist parties have already won a working majority in the Turkish parliament for the next 5 years. Now, there were talks, and there's some examples of fraud that's being talked about. It's very hard to pinpoint to what extent they've had an effect. I suspect that some of this was quite systematic, but probably does not change the results of the election. What we're really seeing here, which is quite fascinating, is actually that the divides in the society are really not economic, and they're not even political. They're actually quite cultural. Because in most normal countries, when you have the economic disaster, which is the Turkish economy, an earthquake that was entirely mishandled by the current regime, whoever was in power would lose by 20 points, which obviously didn't happen in this case. This election result in the first round can actually be seen in cultural terms as the final and total victory of the Islamic nationalist forces in Turkey over the Kemalist white Turks. which is, by the way, quite ironic because these are the same people that set up the system that murdered the Armenians, then the Greeks, and has been killing Kurds for 100 years, and has finally turned on themselves. Karma does exist. An interesting sideshow in these elections was actually the person who finished third. It's this guy named Sinan Ogan, is a very hardcore fascist, former member of the Grey Wolves, probably still a member of the Grey Wolves. He happens to be an ethnic Azeri, and there's actually a lot of rumors in Turkey that he was actually a candidate that was financed by none other than Ilham Aliyev to help his friend to make sure that the elections go to the second round when they were not expecting to perform this well. In trying to analyze this, in reality, Erdogan was never going to lose these elections. Democracy at this stage in Turkey is frankly more performer's art than anything, and it's not real in any functional way because he controls all layers of society, and even if most of the voting that happens is done honestly, it never happens in an environment that he could actually lose. What's ironic is that whomever actually wins this election, which at this point is very likely to be Erdogan, it could actually end up being the loser because at the end of the day, there's a dramatic balance of payment and economic crisis coming in their way. And it's somewhat fitting that Erdogan, who's the one whose own idiotic economic policies have created the moment, will be the person who needs to deal with it. When it comes to Armenia, frankly, all of this means that not much changes. An opposition victory would have been probably slightly more advantageous to Armenia, but we should not expect any dramatic changes in that country from any of their different factions because of their almost essential and existential issues that they have with this country. Let's move on to the last and final item of the week, which is the latest aggressions against the borders of Armenia by the Aliyev regime. This happened by Sotk, which is a town which has a famous gold mine in it. And this was an attack on Sotk, and it actually expanded to the nearby communities. It was very clear that this was supposed to be followed up by a large-scale incursion into Armenia, into that region, probably to seize the gold mine. However, their plans did not work. The Armenian military responded quite effectively. And in fact, Aliyev's troops were given a bloody hiding. They're announcing 1 dead, but in reality, it's somewhere between 8 to 10. Once you do the funeral tracking on TikTok, which is very common in that country, we had 1 loss on our side and a few wounded. And on their side, there were tons and tons of destroyed equipment, and you see it on different videos that are put up by both sides. What we're really looking at here, there's a pattern of aggression that before any negotiations that happen, especially if they happen in the West, there's always aggression by Azerbaijan, probably likely green-lighted by Moscow, as an intimidation tactic. It did not go amiss to anyone that this happened immediately right before the summit that was supposed to happen over the weekend. And I think this was a way for Aliyev to say that essentially to sideline the EU mission at Armenia's border, saying it's irrelevant. Even if you're there, we can still attack, we can still do damage, or we can still conquer new territory. And in this case, their attempts entirely failed. In analyzing these latest crashes, what's important and frankly what's relevant is that for the first time since the 2020 war, we're actually seeing the results of very clear improvements in reforms in doctrine, and command and control systems in the Armenian military, and most importantly, on the use of new advanced weapons that actually did so much of the damage against the enemy's positions and equipment. In conclusion, in reality, more was done for the cause of peace and our security in the battlefield last week by our troops and the way they behaved and the way they responded than all of the diplomatic talks that have happened for the last 2.5 years. Thank you for joining me this week's Sotk Insights.
This is where we hold them. This is where we fight. This is where they die. And these shields, boys. Remember this day, man, for it will be yours for all time.